Night over the Black Sea is a quiet deception. From above, a heavy mothership crawls through the dark, its four engines humming, its wings broad and slow like a barge. Under each wing hangs a fighter, two compact silhouettes with propellers spinning, their pilots peering into the dark, instruments lit in a faint sea-green glow. The bomber is a Tupolev TB-3. The fighters are Polikarpov I-16s. Together they are one machine, a composite weapon the Soviets called Zveno, the flight. And tonight they are hunting. This is a story that sounds like science fiction, yet it happened, documented in test reports, unit logs, and post-war memoirs. It begins in Moscow in the early 1930s with an engineer named Vladimir Vakhmistrov, and it culminates a decade later in the flame of oil tanks at Constanța, the shudder of a Danube bridge at Cernavodă, and the roar of fighters cutting loose like arrows from a longbow. In June 1931, at the Air Force Scientific Test Institute, NIIVVS, he began experimenting with composite aircraft. A heavy bomber would carry small fighters to extend their range, escort the bomber, or let them deliver weapon loads too heavy for a normal takeoff. The very first trials used a Tupolev TB-1 with two tiny Tupolev I-4 fighters perched on top. On 3 December 1931, they flew. The separation nearly went wrong. One latch released out of sequence, but the bomber kept flying and the second fighter detached cleanly. It was not the last time the program would flirt with catastrophe. Over the next few years, the combinations multiplied and grew stranger. A TB-3 carried Polikarpov I-5 biplanes, sometimes two on the wings and a third mounted on the fuselage spine like a rider. Then came fighters slung underneath the wings, Grigorovich IZ monoplanes, attached by a pivoting frame that had to be locked rigid in flight. One IZ pilot missed the moment, and the fighter's lift broke the docking frame. He died when the aircraft struck the TB-3's belly. The work continued. Vakhmistrov and his pilots learned quickly. Top-mounted aircraft suffered in dirty airflow. Underslung fighters with retractable gear were safer. The little Polikarpov I-16, fast for its era and compact, became the Parasite of choice. By 1935, they had a TB-3 with two I-16s attached on the ground and released in flight. In 1939, in a daring demonstration, they even practiced in-air docking using retractable trapezes, fighters snaring hooks underneath the bomber's wings. It worked, but it was judged too risky for operations. Publicly, crews joked about Vakhmistrov's circus, a flying menagerie of absurd contraptions. Privately, test pilots and engineers refined a methodical system. Rigid mounting frames, dual latches controlled by the fighter pilot, synchronized throttle procedures during takeoff to keep airflow smooth, emergency protocols if a latch jammed. The bomber's crew watched the loads, temperatures, and vibrations like hawks. The fighter's engines ran during the entire flight, their prop wash licking the TB-3's wing. Fuel transfer umbilicals were studied. Limited experiments occurred, but in service they would not be used. By 1937-1938, the concept had matured into a single, purpose-built configuration, Zveno-SPB. The acronym stands for Sostavnoy Pikiruyashi Bombardiershik, the composite dive bomber. The carrier aircraft was a Tupolev TB-3 4AM-34FRN, fitted with a more powerful version of its Mikulin engines. Under each wing, rigid frames held a single Polikarpov I-16. Early prototypes used Type 5 fighters, but the operational sets would employ Type 24s, with increased power and some structural improvements. Each I-16 carried 2 FAB-250 bombs, half a ton total per fighter. No I-16 could leave the ground with that load, but it could fly with it if you lifted the airplane into the sky. That was the key. The bomber did the lifting. The fighters did the striking. War pushed the concept from curiosity to necessity. In 1940, test flights of production Zveno-SPB combinations began. 6 TB-3 carriers and 12 modified I-16 Type 24s were formed into a special detachment of the Black Sea Fleet Air Force, based at Yevpatoria in western Crimea. Within the regiment, the detachment was known as Shubakov's Circus, after its commander, Arseny Shubakov. The name carried both pride and a hint of gallows humor. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Black Sea Theater took on a complicated geography. The Axis ally Romania guarded the fuel lifelines of the German war machine, the Ploiești oil fields and refineries, pipelines to the port of Constanța, and railway and road links across the Danube at Cernavodă, where the King Carol I Bridge, a mile-long complex, carried critical traffic. These targets were long-range, heavily defended, and difficult to hit with ordinary level bombers. The Red Army Air Force had no dedicated dive bombers at the start of the war. The Zveno-SPB offered something unusual, a surgical strike at unexpected range. On 26 July 1941, 2 TB-3s with their paired I-16s crossed the Black Sea. At a pre-planned point, roughly 40 kilometers from the target, the fighters released. Free of the mothership and heavy with bombs, they went low and fast. The target was an oil depot at Constanța. Diving through the flak, the I-16s delivered their bombs and escaped without loss. For the Zveno crews, it was proof. The weapon was real. The Cernavodă Bridge. On 10 August 1941, 3 TB-3s launched. The fighter pilots had additional 95-liter auxiliary fuel tanks under their wings for extra endurance. 1 TB-3 turned back with mechanical issues. The remaining 2 released 4 I-16s close to the Romanian coast. Each Polikarpov went into a steep dive on the bridge spans. Bomb racks clattering, engines screaming at the edge of compressibility that pilots of the era knew by feel in their bones. All 4 returned to Crimea. The damage was serious, but not fatal. 3 days later, 13 August, they returned with 6 I-16s. 5 direct hits were recorded. 1 span collapsed. On the way home, the fighters strafed troops near Sulina at the Danube mouth and landed without loss. In the TB-3 cockpits, flight engineers noted the instruments with relief. Oil temps fine, vibration within limits, fuel balances acceptable. In the fighter cockpits, pilots felt something else. The odd quiet of a mission that required absolute coordination and left very little room for improvisation. Word of the raids reached higher command. 2 more TB-3 carriers were readied, bringing the total to 5 operational Zveno-SPB sets. The bottleneck was not enthusiasm, it was engines. The powerful AM-34FRN motors were scarce, and TB-3 airframes with lesser engines simply could not lift the composite load safely. On 16 August 1941, Navy Commissar Nikolai Kuznetsov requested additional TB-3s with the right engines from the Air Force. The answer, in the desperate first summer of the war, was no. Still, the missions continued. On 17 August, the detachment hit a dry dock at Constanța. At the end of the month, on 28 August, Zveno launched I-16s bombed a Dnieper River bridge captured by German forces. One fighter was lost in those late August operations. The next day, 4 I-16s tangled with Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Claims recorded 2 German fighters downed. The unit's war diary, like many wartime logs, shows confidence rising with each successful return. Contested. Some details of these raids, exact damage assessments, the number of sorties, and specific pilot tallies vary among sources. Contemporary Soviet reports leaned optimistic, as wartime reporting often did. Post-war research generally agrees on the dates and the broad outcomes, but differs on the extent of permanent damage to the Cernavodă complex and subsequent repair timelines. What is clear and broadly corroborated, the Zveno-SPB delivered precision dive bombing at unusual range, without the losses expected of a much larger bomber formation. To understand how it worked, you have to imagine the cockpit choreography. The TB-3 crew, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, gunners, managed a machine already old by 1941. The TB-3 was designed in the late 1920s, a corrugated skin monoplane with fixed landing gear, cruising barely above 150 miles per hour, about 240 to 270 kilometers per hour, depending on load and altitude. The Circus TB-3s had uprated engines and reinforced wing hardpoints, but they remained slow, stable workhorses. Fully loaded with 2 fighters, the composite aircraft weighed around 20 tons. Takeoff required a long runway, full power on all 6 engines, 4 on the TB-3, 1 on each I-16, throttle settings matched to avoid asymmetric wake. The I-16 pilots climbed into their fighters on the ground, canopies latched, bombs hung under their fuselages. Their landing gear was retracted once attached, sitting inches above the ground. They ran their engines through takeoff to keep the airflow steady across the TB-3's wing and rudder. In the climb, they monitored engine temperatures carefully. Too rich, and they risked fouling plugs. Too lean, and heat would rise. There was no romance in these moments, only checklists: prop pitch, mixture, magnetos, oil pressure, cylinder head temperature. The Zveno release was a ballet. At the point chosen by the navigator, accounting for wind drift, flak belts, and the fighter's endurance, the TB-3 leveled. Fighter pilots reached for 2 handles, one for the tail lock, one for the nose latches. The sequence mattered. Improper release could pitch the I-16 into the TB-3's wing. When it worked, the fighter simply lifted off its cradle and slid outboard into free air, the bomber's wingtip struts momentarily shivering in the disturbed flow. One, then the other. 2 fighters suddenly free, their small frames seeming to leap with relief. From there, the I-16s performed like ordinary fighters, except for the half-ton of bombs. The Type 24 was compact, robust, and responsive. In a dive, it could reach high sub-400 miles per hour speeds, estimates vary by altitude, more than enough to deliver precise hits with the FAB-250. The pilots trained to withstand the dive forces, to time the release, and to pull out without ripping the wings. It wasn't a Stuka with dive brakes and a siren. It was a nimble little monoplane pushed to the edge of its envelope. The TB-3, relieved of the Parasite fighters, turned for home. That vulnerability was Zveno's Achilles heel. Alone, the bomber was slow and large, a hungry target for any Axis fighter out to sea. The composites depended on darkness, surprise, and careful routing. They rarely flew deep inland beyond the coast. The sea offered an open expanse with fewer patrols, and the targets, oil tanks, docks, bridges, lay near the water. On the return leg, the I-16s formed up over the sea and nursed their fuel. The extra 95-liter tanks, when carried, bought only minutes. Once past the coast, they climbed to meet the TB-3 or went straight to Yevpatoria. Landing with empty fuselage racks and hot engines, they taxied past ground crews who had learned to keep fingers away from the fighter's exhaust and to step around the TB-3's tires, each as high as a man's chest. Operationally, the Zveno-SPB had clear advantages. First, range. The TB-3 ferried short-legged fighters across hundreds of kilometers of sea. The combination put targets like Constanța within reach of agile aircraft that would otherwise never see them. Second, precision. Dive bombing two 250-kilogram bombs from each I-16 gave the detachment a small but accurate punch, ideal for bridges, docks, and storage tanks. In 1941, when the Red Army lacked a reliable, dedicated dive bomber, this mattered. Third, surprise. Radar coverage around the Black Sea was patchy early in the war, and Romanian defenses expected conventional bomber streams from known headings and altitudes. A handful of fighters appearing low and fast from an unexpected quarter could slip through gaps in flak curtains that would shred a mass formation. But there were serious risks and limitations. The TB-3 was obsolete. Against German Bf-109s or even Romanian fighters, its survival depended on luck and timing. Even with the uprated Mikulin AM-34 FRN engines, takeoff margins were slim. An engine failure during the roll could be fatal. The structural loads on the wing mounts, especially in turbulence, were carefully monitored. A misrigged fixture could vibrate loose. Ground handling was slow. The entire system demanded hand-picked crews, extra training, long runways, and, above all, those scarce engines. It was never going to be mass-produced. There was also a doctrine problem. Composite aircraft were a hybrid solution born in a narrow window of aviation history, after the rise of fast monoplanes, but before reliable long-range escorts and plentiful dive bombers. As the war matured, newer platforms overtook Zveno's niche. The Petliakov P-2 dive bomber entered service in numbers. Later, Il-2 ground attack aircraft and improved bombers carried heavier loads with less complexity. By 1942, with Axis air superiority stronger over the Black Sea and the TB-3s increasingly vulnerable, Zveno operations ceased. Estimated, surviving reports point to at least 30 combat sorties by Zveno-SPB in 1941. Most clustered in late July and August, with low losses compared to the effects achieved. Exact totals vary because wartime logs were scattered between Navy and Air Force files, and some after-action reports were compiled retrospectively. Beyond the statistics lies the human experience of those crews. Test pilots like P.M. Stefanovsky, who flew early Zveno combinations, and operational leaders like Arseny Shubikov came from a Soviet aviation culture that valued bold demonstrations yet demanded rigorous discipline. In their recollections, the Zveno's mood oscillates between circus and laboratory. Nicknames and jokes in the ready room, and then strict silence in the cockpit while watching a needle edge toward the red. Ground crews learned to service two different aircraft at once. Armorers swung bombs under a fighter fuselage that sat at chest height. Riggers inspected wing frames with the intensity of shipwrights. Pilots of the I-16s, a small, pugnacious airplane nicknamed Ishak, the Little Donkey, learned a new rhythm of war. There was no takeoff adrenaline, no sweating a short runway with a heavy bomb load. Instead, they waited in the hum of the TB-3's wing, feeling the flex through the mount, the airflow buffeting the canopy. Release was an instant of freedom and risk. Dive angles were steeper than most had ever flown, the seaside air framed by the black pencil lines of bridge trusses growing fast in the windscreen. Their success depended on timing more than brute force. For the TB-3 crews, the mission was endurance. Keep the ship steady, watch the engines, navigate by sea and stars to a precise point, then let the fighters go. Turn for home and trust the darkness to cover a slow retreat. There is a temptation to see Zveno as a dead end, a curiosity that made a splash and vanished. That would be too simple. Across the world, the 1930s saw several composite aircraft experiments. Britain's short Mayo composite mated a small seaplane atop a larger one for long-range mail flights. Germany's wartime Mistel placed an unmanned bomber filled with explosives under a fighter control module for guided strikes. Post-war, the United States tested the FICON concept, a fighter reconnaissance aircraft carried by a B-36. Each experiment tried to solve the same problem: how to project force farther than a single airframe could manage. Zveno-SPB was the rare version that worked operationally, and it did so in a very specific environment: the Black Sea in the summer of 1941, with critical targets clustered along coasts and rivers, with a slow mothership that could approach at night or low, and a nimble Parasite that could dive with accuracy once released. In that setting, a handful of aircraft achieved what many larger raids could not. The system did not scale, and history moved on. But the engineering lessons about structural loads, aerodynamic interference, release mechanisms, and cockpit procedures were real, written in the logs of NIVVS and in training notes. The Zveno program also trained a mindset that aviation could combine airframes in new ways to solve tactical problems, even if only for a season. Look again at the Black Sea night. A carrier bomber, corrugated skin silvered by moonlight, lumbers toward a coast lined with searchlights. Two fighters dangle under its wings, their propellers carving pale discs in the dark. On the intercom, short phrases: speed, altitude, winds. In the fighter cockpits, gloved hands check the release handles. The navigator counts down to the point. The bomber steadies, engines thrumming. Latches clack. One fighter slips away, then the other. Separate splinters of intent, both heavy, both deadly. Moments later, over a black ribbon of water strung with steel, a pilot tips his nose down and watches a bridge grow larger in the sight. His airplane, an I-16 that could never have left the ground with the bombs it carries, is now a spear thrown from the sky. He holds the dive until the truss fills the glass. He toggles the release. The aircraft trembles as the weight leaves. He pulls. G-forces claw at his neck. The span erupts in sparks and smoke. The pilot levels, gathers speed, and points for the glinting sea. Far out over that same sea, a TB-3 turns for home. The space beneath its wings suddenly empty. The air smoother. The task half done. That is the essence of Zveno. A quiet deception, a temporary union of machines to make a strike that neither could achieve alone. In the months that followed those Black Sea raids, the front lines surged and bent. Priorities changed. By 1942, with Axis fighters more numerous over the coast, and the TB-3 a relic in a world that demanded speed, the Zveno-SPB detachment stood down. The composite carriers did not return. The idea, however, had proven itself. In the narrow slice of time where it could exist, between older bombers and future dive bombers, it had been decisive. Post-war narratives sometimes oversell Zveno as a flying aircraft carrier meant for routine fighter escort. The operational record shows its actual doctrine: long-range precision attack with dive-bombing fighters, not day-to-day escort duty. The in-air redocking that fascinated test engineers remained a test-range trick, not a combat technique. What remains uncontested is the ingenuity of the crews who flew it. They took an old bomber, a nimble fighter, and a handful of bolts and frames, and built a weapon that changed the calculus over one sea in one critical summer. Their successes did not win the war, but they did set a bridge trembling, and they set an oil port ablaze. And they showed that in war, as in engineering, sometimes the solution is not to build a new machine, but to combine two familiar ones in a way no one expects. And for a few weeks in 1941, over the coastlines of the Black Sea, that unexpected solution worked.